Good evening. It is so great to be back with you. And we have my wife, Athena. How are you?
Hello, I'm good.
Welcome back. I think you are our most frequent guest outside of well, Pastor
Oh,
Marco can't be a guest anymore. He's the boss.
right.
But yeah, this is your third time?
Oh, it's my second.
No, it's not. Esther.
Oh, right. Yes, thanks.
Clearly, it means more to me than
I'll
her.
expect my medal in the mail,
No,
my ribbon.
we don't give away third place prizes. We don't do that. So, but listen, welcome. We're so happy that you're here. The last couple weeks, we've had a great conversation. It was with Bishop and Pastor Marco, and last week you had the gentleman come and speak. But this week, we are actually doing something that we don't typically do, and we're looking at Sunday. Now, in all honesty, this was Sunday a couple weeks ago,
Yeah.
but for the last few weeks, maybe even a month now, Pastor Marco has really been talking about change and using Joshua to do that. And so before we even get into that, Athena, one of the things that I just want to, maybe people don't even know is you are the brains behind life groups. You're the one who's providing us the questions and
Yes.
getting the conversation going. And so, I don't know, how has that been for you, life groups and all of these things?
It's been really great, actually. It's nice to get that like notification that somebody else wants to be a part of a life group because you know they're plugging in. And it's amazing how many people haven't plugged in and they've been here for, I mean, some people have been here for literally over a decade, just now getting engaged. So this is really, it's been a great opportunity to connect and just to kind of facilitate that and foster that type of connection. So it's cool being on the back end and seeing all that go down.
Well, also, I think it's really, I'm not going to speak for you, so you can tell me, but it seems as though you're even listening to the sermon a different way.
Yeah.
Right? Because now you're bringing up these talking points, and I think this really is what brings this conversation kind of full circle, because you've been kind of on this other end, not just listening for you, but listening for others. What's that been like?
It's definitely been different because even things that maybe I have heard not for the first time, but I'm like, you know what? For someone that may have never heard this, let me make a note of this. Let me write that down. Let me ask that question. Growing up in church, you find a lot of things for granted, like even things like baptism. It's like my heart is so full when I see someone baptized and I'm like, I was baptized. I've seen baptisms forever. And there's still something about it when someone comes to Christ and they get baptized. You're just like, yes. So hearing certain things for when I'm listening for somebody else, it just is a different level of even understanding. And it's cool, to be able to just know that people are really engaging in the sermon in that way that they maybe have never done before. A lot of people may just take notes and then review them on their own, but to have that dialogue, that conversation, and learn not only from what is spoken on Sunday, but from other people that may have heard other things, or because you're not going to retain everything,
right?
But being able to have those people to really just pick out pieces that you didn't even think of, and then now allow that throughout the week to really begin to chew on that. So that's really cool.
So as much as this is definitely, one of our Bible studies, this is kind of a look in kind of to what it would be like to kind of have a life group, right? Because we would take kind of what happened on Sunday, and then we, as Pastor Marco likes to say, we chop it up, right? We have that discussion, and we really see what comes out, what can we pull for ourselves, and how does this timeless book become practical today?
Right.
So with that being said, we are going to get right into it. Athena is going to read our scripture, and we'll go from there.
Great. So we are going to read Joshua chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. It says, Now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth. Sorry about that. Now, this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about in the wilderness 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land he had solemnly promised their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were circumcised, they were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. And after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day.
All right. So I'm not gonna lie to you. Hearing the word circumcised that often,
It's so many
I
times.
don't. I think I get it. I think this whole passage has to do with being circumcised, and I really don't want to go into any more detail than that. Google it or don't, just whatever.
Right.
But okay. But so here's what's going on. For those of you who may just be tuning in, maybe haven't been following along on Sundays, but here's what's happening. What's happening is Moses has died. Joshua has taken over. These are the Israelites that were slaves. They've come over. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've been walking around for 40 years in the wilderness, relying on this promise from God that one day they're going to be in what they call the promised land, this place that God has for them to live out the rest of their life. And then we recognize that some things go sideways, some people just disobey, in crazy ways, and God ends up saying, you know what, I will keep my promise that I made to you as a people,
Right.
but you as an individual, you're not going to be able to go. You don't have faith, and so you know what, you get what you believe. You didn't believe you'd make it, so you die. And so here's what happens. And so we get to this part, and just before this, what we find is that they get right to the Jordan River, recognizing that the Jordan River is like the last stop before they get into this promised land. But it's high water season. It's flooding. It's, now I don't know if this is true, but in my mind, I think of like rapids and,
Right,
like
yeah.
you're just, that's not something you're just going to walk through or just going to, swim across. And yet, just like God did for them with the Red Sea, all of a sudden, God's telling them, hey, take your leaders, go out first. They go out first. It's dry ground. So this raging river, these rapids, these, white foamy waters just absolutely stop. All of these Israelites walk across, and here's where we are. Now, for me, that first verse that you read really stood out to me because it's this idea that I don't know how this gets in the Bible. Like, who is telling the writer of Joshua, which we obviously believe is Joshua, but who is telling him what other people are thinking? How is it that they are now on the other side of the other side of the Jordan, and there are kings that are scared of them, and they've done nothing? I think that is my first observation. This idea that, man, there's already fear in these nomads who've done nothing. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that, or any observations that immediately jump out at you?
I mean, I know that, again, going back to the context, they did at some point send the spies, and Rahab enters the scene, and she tells them, like, listen, this is basically yours at this point. We're just kind of waiting to see when you take over. But to your point, to like see how this starts with like these kings are in real fear of these Israelites who, it's not like they're a city. They're,
Right.
like you said, they're nomadic people. They're just walking around. And it's just ironic that the king that's behind, these fortified walls. It have all of this massive, armies and technology, according to that time, are afraid of these nomadic people who are just, have been walking around. And so it's just amazing to me how, you know, I guess kind of like tying in the principle of like how there's times when we're, going through things and, we have that promise from God and, we're trying to live it out as much as possible. He'll give us little insights. It's almost like how, what was it, Gideon? How God allowed him to overhear the enemy, and the enemy is like, oh my gosh, did you hear about Gideon? The people are afraid. And now that gave Gideon the courage he needed to go forward. And so it's like, I think it's really cool how like that happens from time to time in the Bible where God's like, no, let me tell you what your enemies think about you. Like they're more afraid than you think they're more afraid of you than you think they are.
Which for me now, right? So if I'm Joshua, I'm leading this group. Now you got to remember, you're coming over the Jordan River, right? A lot of the things you'll see throughout the Bible it'll talk about the plains of the Jordan, right? So when you're coming over the Jordan River, geographically, it's flat, it's lush, it's beautiful. It reminds us of Sodom and Gomorrah. It reminds us of some of these other things. My point is, if I am looking out onto the plains and I see a fortified city, right? I see nothing, and then I see this giant Lego tower, right? Like I realize we're not that far.
Yeah.
And now I know something inside of me, however it happened, knows that they're scared of me. Oh, it's full steam ahead.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it is. This is the time. Gentlemen, we've arrived. Get ready. There's no rest. Let's move on. Let's take care of business, and then tomorrow we feast.
And yet, as we go into the story, we see.
But God.
Right. In verse 2, God's like, oh, great. It's time to circumcise. And I love that it says it's time to circumcise the Israelites again, because we see throughout this part, like, and even as you made mention of, the promise was for the people of Israel. It's for the Israelites as a nation. And so even though the people that were enslaved, they should have been the ones to get the promise. Because of their disobedience, God honors the fact that his people technically are the ones to go in the promise, even though, like you said, the individuals aren't. So in God's eyes, it says the Israelites again. To me, I'm just like, But if we know, as we go through the story, that they hadn't, technically these particular individuals hadn't been circumcised, how God still even honors that part because it's like his people. And even as we were discussing, this idea of, circumcision and how it represents, this, we'll call it sacrifice. How we sacrifice the things that, like that we want to do. And in this particular instance, the idea of covenant, like this really meant something to God, to where he required them to be circumcised before they were able to enter into the promise. And it's just like, it's just crazy to me that just that little word again, even though they'd never done it, just because God is going to honor the fact that they're his people as a whole.
So here's a thought, right? When you're marching towards God's promise, there's no time to circumcise your child. And yet, when you're a slave working how many hours a day in the worst of conditions, they were all circumcised there. See, I'm just wondering, is there something to that? I'm wondering, is there this idea that, and again, the Bible doesn't say this is just pure me just thinking. Is there something to be said about the idea that when I was in Egypt and I was circumcised and I was circumcising my family, my sons, I knew I was still God's people, so there was a promise to come. And so it was so bad that it could only get better. But what happens now when I'm already moving towards that promise and I'm not seeing a change, right? So is there a lack of circumcision? Could it be tied to their lack of belief? They're walking and getting nowhere. I mean, we've read, scholars have said, that amount of people should have been there in 13 days. 2 weeks versus 40 years is a giant length of time. And so I begin to wonder, how do you begin to prioritize those things that God had told you needed to do, those things that said, this is who you are, this is what would separate you. maybe in Egypt that meant something. Now it almost feels like, whatever. We'll get to it when we get to it. If we get to it, what's the big deal? Oh, it's just another thing we have to do, right? And it's just, and so I don't know. And I don't, like I said, I don't know this for a fact, but it just seems like another way that it could be that the Israelites are just tired of waiting because in their own mind, they should be further than where they are.
Yeah, or even the idea of taking it for granted, you know, like even I talked about before with baptism. The idea of seeing baptism occur is like, wow. But in my mind, even though, yes, I was baptized, it's just kind of like, oh, baptism. You know what I mean? So, I mean, who knows? There could be so many different takes on that as far as that's concerned.
So what we see now is, you know, by right, this is really where, you know, Joshua should be sharpening his swords, getting his shields ready, and going for battle. And God tells him, no, you need to make little knives. You know, I think the question that I would have is, if we start looking into the symbolism of circumcision,
Yeah.
right? Certainly not the practice of it or the anatomy of it, but if we just look at the symbolism, you know, some things that immediately stick out to me is, number one, you need to have a delicate tool, right? You can't just do that with a giant knife, right? That's a knife, sword, number one. Number two, you can't do it by yourself, right? Somebody else has to do it for you. And then number three, the older you are, the more painful it is, right? But you had some things that you had pointed out about circumcision, and I really thought that added more color and more fullness to this discussion.
Tell me what you're talking about again. Sorry.
You talked about
we had a long conversation.
You talked about those 3 different points.
Oh, yes. Sorry about that. So when we were discussing like this concept of circumcision, this really goes back to the idea of like what Pastor Marco was talking about, you know, a few weeks ago, where he was talking about living in the covenant. And the idea with circumcision, you know, how we talked about God wanting to make sure his people were circumcised, this particular people. Now we're going to the individual. How important it is, like what it represents. And so for me, I was saying, you know, to me, it divides up into like past, present, and future, where when you, again, using the metaphor of circumcision, it really puts your past in perspective. So we have here in verses 4 through 8, it talks about, like, Joshua goes into why they had to be circumcised. And the idea that the men, you know, that left Egypt, these military men, you know, they cross over the Red Sea. And because of their disobedience, it prevented them from being able to go into the promised land themselves. But now for this newer generation, for their children, it was important for them to understand, like, yes, even though your fathers may have disobeyed or whatever, that it's still important to know, you know, kind of where you came from. There was still a miracle that was done. Not only did God bring them out of slavery, but he defeated the enemy as they were coming out with the whole, you know, thing that happened with the Red Sea. So it puts the past into just perspective, that the years that these children have spent in the wilderness, because at this point, they're probably, you know, at least 40, you know what I'm saying? Like if they were born in the wilderness, like this is not for nothing. And then going into the idea of the present, now we're in a place of preparation. We know the promised land is right ahead of us, as you said. You know, you kind of see this huge wall in front of you. You're like, oh, let's go. But this is something that you now have to do to prepare for the next place, to prepare you for what is about to happen. And how circumcision is something that is so important, because God is saying, this is something that you need to do in order to step into the fullness of the promise that I have for you, you know, that he has for us. And how, like, I think about it in this way, like, you know, we have 3 kids, and every time we knew that we were going to have a baby, it came with a measure of preparation. It came with a measure of, now I can't eat certain foods, or, you know, now I'm not going to be able to move this a certain way, or the idea of even the nesting phase where, you know, you're cleaning up the house and throwing everything out, I guess in my case. I'm like, do you need this? No? Okay, I don't care.
What you're saying is we had 3 children, only you prepared. Sounds like I did
No,
not.
but even for
But
you,
but
like,
but I love that it's something that just comes so natural. You didn't look at it like I have to throw away my favorite stuff because the
right.
baby's coming. It's like, oh no, we need to make room for this blessing.
Exactly, exactly. And so that's what, in this instance, circumcision helps to prepare them in order for them to go to that next place. And then finally, the idea of like just paving the way for the future. This is important for them to get to that next place, the place that they know has been promised to them. They have already heard, listen, these kings are scared of you. You know, this is basically yours. Now you have to step into it. But this process of sacrifice, this process of, you know, really just kind of like dying to self, as we talk about, and that means, you know, basically doing the thing you don't want to do, but that God told you to do. You know, God told you to do it. You don't want to, but you're going to walk in obedience. That obedience is going to get you to that place so that you could really operate. You can really step into it. The promise that you've been waiting so long to happen. And I think even you were talking about like, what are those examples of what circumcision could look like today?
You know, I think often when we look at this, we think, you know, this idea of circumcision, we think of like cutting out, right? And we think like, oh man, okay, so what are those things, right? So, oh, well, I'm gluttonous and I love food and I'm getting fat and getting lazy, so I got to cut out food. Or, you know, if I'm lazy, I need to be active. If I'm not reading my Bible, I need to read my Bible. If I'm, you know, if I got an anger problem, I got to go to anger management, whatever it is. And I don't think that's the metaphor that God's giving us. The reason I say that is because there is nothing inherently wrong. I'm sorry, there's no other way to say this. There's nothing inherently wrong with the skin in that area. Boys are not born deformed because they have foreskin. So you're taking something that's natural, and God is saying you don't need that, right? That is the metaphor of circumcision. So when I think of it personally, what does it mean? You may hear it said in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 17, it talks about your heart being circumcised. And you look at those things, and the way I look at it, it's like this. What are those things that are so natural to me that get in the way? What are those responses? When I feel slighted and I respond in my natural way, how does that get in the way from what God wants to do in me or through me? What is that when there are moments where I let logic overtake faith? What does that look like? What are those moments where fear wins out against hope? What does that look like? And so for me, when I think of this idea of, it's not that it's a negative thing. It's not like it's a cancer that we go in and we cut out and we carve up, but it's this thing that's already natural, this bent that I'm already to. And in some cases, maybe on the outside to everybody else, it's no big deal. On the outside to everybody else, they don't see it because, again, you don't know whether or not somebody's circumcised unless there's like an intimate kind of, you know, scenario. So I think of that. I think of this idea of, you know, isn't it funny? There's a group of men that die off that were circumcised but couldn't get in. And then there's a group of men who can get in, but they're not circumcised. So it's not that there's a formula. Rather, I would, you know, let me throw this out here and let me see what you think about it. But what do you think to the thought that there's a time where that first generation had to trust God. There was nothing else. The sea opened up in front of them. The Bible says that there's a pillar of fire and a cloud. There's manna that just sprouts up, and they were told about this. Then they complain about manna, and then all of a sudden there's quail everywhere. Right. And then you smack a rock and there's water. I mean, they see miracle after every day is just another miracle, and yet these people still don't believe solely in God. Now the kids that grow up in it, is it as miraculous anymore? They know God. They know what God can do, but they don't know God, right? They've seen the effects of God. They see that this God is a provider. If you say that it's when I wake up and we get manna that's from God, then all right, sure, but I wasn't there when there was a command given to Moses to give to. Matter of fact, I don't really know Moses that much. I don't really have a relationship with Moses. Is kind of old and kind of, I know Joshua. I've heard the stories of how brave Joshua and Caleb are, but I don't really know. And I guess my question is, what happens in our lives when when the miracles begin to just become normal and we begin to not be wowed by them or revered by them, or we really start to feel entitled that, well, that's just the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with this idea of an uncircumcised heart?
I think even to go even a little bit deeper than that, it makes me think of the idea of like legacy. So, for example, like when you have parents that are immigrants that come from nothing, and they come to this country and they work their way and they provide, and then they have a next generation of children. When you go from those parents who may not be used to having food on the table every day, and you don't pass that down, the children are now used to having food. They don't know what it's like to not have food until the parents are intentional about saying, no, listen, there was a time where this right here was a luxury, and you're enjoying it now, and you can, partake of it now, but I remember what it was like to not be in this place. And I think that's why it's so important, even the chapter or two before, when God intentionally tells Joshua, get 12 stones, put it in the river. So there is a memorial. It's important for you to remember. And so to the question of the miracle piece, I think that's why it's important for us to really be intentional about like sharing those types of stories, because we want to get to the place where, like how Pastor Marco said, the supernatural is now just natural because we're living in that new place. But to be able to appreciate that, to really go to a better understanding, we must continue to like pass those things down. So for this particular generation, again, where they're not familiar with what being enslaved is because they were not there, the miracle of manna to them is just, this is what we do. Right. It's not, okay, here it is. It's not here on Saturday or whatever the day is. And so it's important for, them to really understand how that even came about. Like the miracle of their parents is like the normal of them, and how going forward, it doesn't mean that you get stuck there, but now there's another level. Like it's almost like how the ceiling becomes the floor. Right. And now we're going to that next place.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, right? Because again, we look at these things, I think that we think with, Western eyes and 2021 and everybody has a camera phone. And so we turn it on and we get evidence on the spot. Yeah. And I think we think that if there's evidence, then I would believe. If I had evidence, all you had to do was prove that there was evidence, right? And then my heart would be right. I look at some of the stories in the Bible where God is most obvious, and it's where the biggest mess ups in human history are, right? There's 3 voices in the Garden of Eden. There's Adam, there's Eve, and there's God. All of a sudden, a talking animal comes by, and everything that they knew about their perfect life was thrown around by some talking animal. Yeah. Right? So this idea that what more evidence do you need than when God was coming for his normal afternoon stroll? Right. And all of a sudden now it's, well, but this animal said, so I figured as much, So it's not about evidence. When we look again with the Israelites, I don't know a group of people for 40 years that had daily evidence that God was with them. And every one of them but 2 died because of their unbelief and because of where their heart was. So I don't think that evidence is our issue. I like what you said. It's about, what are we witnessing? How is that story getting passed down? I can just imagine for some of those people, oh, well, mom, dad, who is Moses? You get an inquisitive kid who's 8, 9 years old. What makes him so special, and why do we just listen when he talks? And he's some guy that heard from God or something. Right. And like, whoa, some guy. oh, did you forget about when the waters, just parted?
Exactly.
I guess I heard this one time, and I don't know if it's a Jewish proverb or a Jewish saying, but they were like, there are always going to be people that when you walk through the Red Sea will complain because they have mud in their sandals.
Right.
That's your issue?
Yep.
Your issue is that your feet have mud on them, not the fact that the waves have. You're walking through a sea, and your biggest concern is, I have mud on my sandals. But there's always going to be that, and I think those are the things that we need to figure out. God, how do I cut those parts of me that are I'm so bent naturally to look for the negative, so bent to look for how it's not going to work, so bent to expect these negative things, the worst, the bottom to fall out. What do I do with that? And and here we go. Now we have this new generation who we're asking them to forget by remembering. Right? And I think there's a story in that, right? You need to forget what you've taken for granted. You need to forget what your mother said, your father said, your sister said, whatever the case is. You need to forget those things, and I know you can do that by remembering. Right? One of the things that we find in the Bible as a whole is that so much of what we do cognitively, the Bible does physically. So, for example, God says that, I will not forget you, right? I will remember you. I will remember my covenant with you. But the evidence or the way we witness to God remembering us is that something is done, right? And I think this is the opportunity that they have now to remember God. It's their time to remember why we're here. It's their time for these. Because, we talked about this. Why wasn't this done before they crossed over? Why was it when there was a natural barrier where the kings couldn't come over and attack them while they were healing? Why didn't God just say on that side of the water, hey, do this, then after that you'll come and you'll take it? And while the Bible doesn't have a straight answer, I do think, whether you like it or not, some of these people, I'm just imagining, you got to fake it till you make it. You're getting circumcised because that's what Joshua said. And you may not want to, and you may think this is absurd and ridiculous and everything else, but the only other way was to cross back over into these raging waters and press your luck going backwards if you want. But there's never been anything backwards if God's always moving forward.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too because, we talked about how obviously these people haven't been circumcised, and yet they were still able to cross the Red Sea. There was still a measure of the promise that they were able to taste, but it's that real fullness that, entering in, being able to be victorious in Jericho and the subsequent cities that they were not going to be able to partake of. And I think about that, going again to today and the practical piece. The first thing that comes to mind is the idea of forgiveness. And because forgiveness is it's such an intimate thing. It's such an internal thing because you may forgive someone or God may be telling you to forgive someone who you can never communicate with again. But the idea of that's what we're talking about, going to the heart, why it's so important to be obedient is because God is trying to get you to that next place. You may have experienced success from every which way, but it's okay, before you move on, you need to deal with this, whether it's a family member, a friend, or whomever. Or forgive yourself. You need to get to that place where this is something that you don't want to do, but you do need to do it in order to experience that, that promise. There could be several. So even Minister Lauren talked about tithing. The idea of tithing is something that, again, you may have never done. You may have been in the church 10 years, 14 years, however long, and have never participated in that. And now God is okay, you've heard the word.
'Tis the season.
It's time to tithe. And until you do so, again, you will be hindered from the fullness of the promise that God has. And it's so interesting because even when it says, make flint knives. So now we have this process of circumcision. Now I have to create the tool, like you said, delicate, but now I have to go and make this thing in order
knowing what it's for.
Exactly.
Again, you get to say that all, well, when I was pregnant, I was nesting. Well, listen, the time I was making my scalpel to snip myself, that's a little bit different.
Right.
Let me just tell you, those rocks were never handled more with care than when all the men went out together and it's like, tap, 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 tap.
Exactly.
So,
but even flint is something that's so strong.
Right.
You know what I mean? And you have this strong tool for such a delicate thing. You know what I mean? And it's like, again, going back to forgiveness, going back to tithing, going back to these different areas where it's like, it's a strong word,
Well,
And it's like, but internally, when we think about the cutting away, when we think about, even something like, I want to respond in this way, or I want to, say whatever I feel like, and the Holy Spirit's like, be quiet. This is not how we're going to work. If you want to get to the place that I have for you, it means you got to tame that tongue. You got to reel it in. You know what I mean? So it's like those things are where it's tough, but it's necessary.
Well, there's two things I want to say. One of them is, we kind of glossed over it, but let's spend a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know the anatomy of it, and I don't ever want to know the anatomy of it. All right, I've been fighting to tell this story. It doesn't even fit, but I'm going to tell it anyway.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. So I'm sure you remember when you gave birth to Micah, our son. I think you were there.
I think so.
Okay, great. So weirdest thing happened. This is a true story. So Micah he gets circumcised, not because of biblical, that's what we decided to do, right? So Micah gets circumcised. I was never more uncomfortable, and I don't know if you remember this or not, but when nurses came in to congratulate us because
Yes.
the doctor did such a great job on circumcising him that they were showing my son's junk just around. No, like look at what a great job the doctor did.
Oh, what a beautiful cut.
Oh my gosh, it was just so.
Close the paper.
I don't. To this day, I still don't know if I should be proud or if I should puke. I'm not sure. It has nothing to do with this, but that story has been right here this entire time, so maybe I won't be bothered with it anymore. But that's a true story. Now, the point does go to circumcision, right? So if we're talking about the circumcision, there's a couple things. Number one, you can't do it yourself, right? And I think we can't just say that, like, oh, you can't do it yourself. But no. There is power in allowing someone else to come into this process, right? Now, we're going to get off of the metaphor for now. We're going to get practical, but there's power in saying, I'm dealing with this thing.
Yeah.
And again, it's not always the negative thing, right? And it may be, right? It may be, hey, Athena, I'm dealing with this addiction. And and as my wife, but as my friend, as my, whatever. Okay, there's that. There's also the idea of, do you see anything in me that is just that naturally comes out? What can I do? How can I need help? It's a blind spot. It's something I don't see. I've tamed my tongue, but we like to say, but I haven't fixed my face, right? Like, what does that look like? How do you, it's my body language off, all of those things. But then after that, there's this healing in the meantime.
Yes.
There's a story in Genesis, and I want to say it's in the 30s, maybe 34, somewhere in there, where it's just one of those Bible stories that are just weird, right? It makes for a great movie if somebody ever does it. But long story short, there is Jacob's family. Jacob has a daughter. His daughter gets sexually assaulted. And so the brothers are conspiring, Simeon and Levi, they conspire and they say, okay, we got something for that. And so they don't immediately take revenge. But what they do is they say this. They say, hey, you want to marry our daughter. You want to marry our sister. Fine. No problem. Here's what we got to do, though. But all of you, your entire, Shechem, it was Shechemites.
Yeah.
The Shechemites, you need to circumcise yourself because this is who we are. And if you want to be, part of us, then that's what you have to do. And so the Shechemites get flint knives and they circumcise themselves. And then on the third day, the Bible says, while they were still in pain, right? So not healed yet, here come Levi and Simeon and their brothers and the people of Israel, and they kill all of them out of revenge for their sister. What am I saying? I'm saying that, man, when you are going through this, you become vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it hurts. You've got to imagine, right? We're sitting here, Can you imagine what it might have been like to be a child or a woman right now as your husband is healing and you're saying, I see the promise, but at the same time, they have armies too. My husband is here bandaged up and we're taking care of him. But what if they come to get us? What if, and there's a trust now that in my mind has to spread throughout the camp, right? The men had a trust in one way, but the women and the children and those that they protected had a trust in a very different way to say, God alone is my protector because the one that's supposed to be here, my husband can't do it. My older son can't do it. My brother isn't here to do it for me. Wow. And so there is this healing that comes that we need to allow for. We can't just go over. It's not going to be easy. When you are taking out things that are natural, I think you did, right? Wisdom teeth? Did you
I
have to
did,
take it
yeah.
out?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Those are natural. There's nothing wrong with wisdom teeth. They are yours. They are from God. They are natural. And yet, there are people that need to get them extracted, even though they're natural, right? There are some things that are just natural, but they're not right. They're not for us. They're not good for us. And then there's a healing process, right? Again, mine never came in, so I got lucky, but there's a whole healing after. There's things you can eat, things you can't eat. There's funny videos to be made when you come back out from what's that? The
Anesthesia.
You
Yeah.
make sure that if you have a kid, you make sure you ask them crazy questions.
You record it.
You got to. You go viral. You tag KOCC, hashtag KOCC. But the point though is we got to give time for healing.
Yeah. That's absolutely important because it's not just the time that is necessary to, prepare to be circumcised. Then you have the pain of circumcision and then the post-circumcision pain.
There you go.
So it's like, so again, even using the idea of like having a baby, the idea of, yeah, there's pain obviously as you're having a kid, but then you still have to heal. You still have to go through that process. And even when it comes to, when we talk about forgiveness or we talk about tithing, you now have to rearrange some things. So using the tithing example, if you're used to having 100% of your money, now that you only have 90, your budget's going to look a little different.
Or now that you still have 90.
Yes, you still have 90. But like I said, your budget's going to look a little differently. You may not be able to go out an extra time. You may not be able to.
It's going to cost you.
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea of that, with all of these things that, God has called us to do, it requires a lifestyle change. And I mean, even we talk about how it says here in, where does it say? In verse 8 of chapter 5, it says how they remained where they were in the camp until they were healed. And then after that, that's when God talks about, rolling away the reproach of Egypt. That healing process is always necessary. And I want to make sure that I talk about that too, because we might think, oh, I forgave, so therefore that's it. We're done. We can move on. And it's like, no, this is days. It's not like you get circumcised 9 a.m. today and then tomorrow they're taking the land. They still have to
take a Tylenol, call me in the
morning.
morning.
Exactly. They still have to heal. And the things that God has called us to, when we're living a life that we are sacrificing, we're becoming more obedient to who God has called us to be in order for us to really step into the fullness of what He's called us. It's going to take some time. There's going to be a process of healing. We may, again, using the pregnancy analogy, when I had my children and I needed to get up to go to the bathroom, it was like, it took a little time. And so even using tithing, now you have that 10% that you've given. It might be like, oh, I really want to go out, but I can't because I don't have that money. And it might, even that freezing, I'm glad you even corrected me from the idea of like, now I get to keep 90% versus having to give up 10. Your words are going to have to be different. Your mindset's going to have to be different. And that is the process until it now becomes, once you're fully healed, then you're like, okay, you may remember the pain, but it's not something that's going to affect you in the same way. And that's why it's so important to allow yourself to heal, allow yourself to go through that process so that you can now fully step into what God has for you.
You talked about verse 8, and it's funny because it says in verse 9, it was after they healed that the Lord spoke.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You can go through these things, but don't think that God's holding your hand through all of it. I'm not saying He's not with you. Of course He's with you. But
right.
What I'm saying is, You are now this circumcision, this getting your heart right, these things that have been so natural. It may not be every day that you get a pat on the back from God
Right.
that says, "Hey, you're doing okay." It may not be that God is sending down angels to come and to feed you, like, or birds like he did with Elijah. But when he's ready, right? Your healing is just as much a part of your process as the cutting, right?
Yeah.
That healing is, that cutting, there's fear in that. There's, oh my gosh, what if we mess up? What if we miss? What if we, oh my gosh, what if I'm half the man I used to be? What I mean? There's all kinds of stuff. But that healing, man, that healing now says, now God, while I'm here and I'm on my back and I'm healing, and God, while I am trusting you with my heart, every time I see that name, every time I look at those old pictures, every time I can't I have to forgive again, and it's still raw, and I see them, and now, of course, now I get a text message from them, but I'm forgiving, and it's in that I think that God is giving you those opportunities. Not that he's not there, not that he's not listening, but he doesn't speak until they're healed.
Right. Now the bill shows up, and you're like, oh,
right,
that 10%.
Exactly. And so, one thing I think for the Israelites that made it so worth it, and maybe for us, maybe we've not yet had that experience, but they got a taste. Not all of them, but we talked about when the spies came back, they had these giant grapes, and they talked about grapes that were huge and fruit that was plentiful, and they talk about the land of milk and honey. And I guess my point is this: is that we go through this process so that no longer is the fruit from the land that you promised, but it's now our fruit, right? And there's a difference between, oh, it's just that thing over that blessing that God has for me, than me walking in that blessing.
Right. It's not over there anymore. It's now here.
I'm not just getting a taste. See, I think sometimes God gives us a taste so then we can have a craving, so then we can go whatever it takes.
Yeah.
Right? I will say, if we go back to pregnancy, I don't remember you having any crazy cravings.
No.
Chick-fil-A, which I
That's not crazy though.
Well, we went from no Chick-fil-A except for like going down south.
We were driving like a half an hour.
But it was delicious. It was delightful. You could be pregnant 6 more times if it was Chick-fil-A, Bernat. But exactly. But you had a taste, and it wasn't that you weren't being fed. It wasn't that you weren't eating. We could have a steak, and you go, it's Chick-fil-A. But we ate. But I want Chick-fil-A. And so, okay, it's not that you were hungry and you were malnourished. It was, but I have a taste for something. I've tasted it, and that's the thing. And so whatever it takes to get that thing, yeah, I get it, I already ate. Or we've said, all right, you know what? When it was just 2 of us, let's just go, and we'll go early. We'll do an early dinner or whatever, a late lunch, whatever. We'll move our schedule around so we can get there. Okay, great, and we'll do that. And I think that's when you've tasted, right? I mean, the Bible says, taste and see that the Lord is good, right? When we can get that taste just enough to build a craving in us that makes us now do whatever it takes. It makes the midnight runs seem normal. It makes the idea that we're trying to pay off, this never happened, trying to pay off Chick-fil-A employees to open on Sunday, right? Like, that makes it normal. Going to the extreme is normal because what's behind it is so worth it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, I think when we look at that, man, how many of us have been there when we've put our eye, I mean, when you really think about it, when we were going to get engaged, I was working 2 jobs. I was working 90 hours a week, all of this. And obviously I say this now just to prove the point, but not to buy a piece of jewelry for your finger. Right now, it was never about the engagement ring. It was about what came with the engagement ring and the life that we believed that we would have together.
Although the ring was important to me.
Well, it better have been. It was the most amount of money I ever spent in something I didn't live in or drive. So yeah, better have been.
Just want to put that.
Right. Swing. Can we just edit a swing in there? No. But that being said, though, in all seriousness, it doesn't feel like a sacrifice when the prize is bigger than whatever punishment I'm going through.
Yeah.
Right? It just feels like that's the cost. And maybe that's where God is trying to bring us. Yes, it hurts in the moment. And yes, while we're healing, it's still vulnerable. But man, you look back on it now and you go, oh man, that ring, and again, it wasn't just the ring, but that ring opened up a life together, which opened up the opportunity to have 3 children, which opened an opportunity for us to work together at the church, which brings us to today.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
so
And I think even though we're not going to completely, go here, one thing that Pastor Marco had talked about in that sermon about when the manna stops, it just hits me so hard where it's like they are, they get circumcised, they partake of the Passover, again, another memory thing like, hey, that God that did that thing and that God has been doing that thing, we're still going to trust in him.
that's our God.
Right. That's what that's what the enemy is afraid of. That like you are attached to this miraculous God. Now they get a taste of the produce, and then it says, and then the manna stopped the next day.
That's right.
And how like sometimes I think that we go through life thinking like exactly that's going to happen. Like God is going to stop that thing. God is going to, prevent me from, my phone's going to break every time this person's number, you know what I mean? Like he's going to do this thing for us, and we're used to a certain way of living. But when we now enter into the promise, it again requires this new standard. What we've now been preparing for, we now have to say, okay, I've been used to every day going outside the tent, the Israelites, and picking the manna up, and now, I could feed my family. Where now we have to cultivate the land. Now we have to, like, God gave us a little starter kit, the fruit's there, but it's not going to be the same as when we were in the wilderness. There's a new level that now, even again, Pastor Marco has been really talking about this idea of together, this idea of we're all doing this. And so even as it talks about, we are co-laborers with God. He set it up nicely. The promised land is there, but they still have to fight. They still have to do all of these things. They get the strategy, but now when it comes to eating it and nourishing and really thriving, now they have a more active role in that. And it is important for us when we talk about doing these things, we got to keep it up. We got to do the work. We have the taste and it's great. But now, like we did, we drove half an hour to go get that
right.
food because we're like, okay, I want to be here.
And it was worth every minute.
It was like our every
my
Monday.
Pleasure.
Exactly.
But I love what you said, right? I mean, there is a sermon in what you just said. We are going from collecting to cultivating.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? And man, how about that? It's funny. I remember back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there's all of these. When you get into the land, here's what you do, and here's
right.
you plant these times, and you collect this way, and you're thinking like, we're in a desert. Why do I care?
Exactly.
I'm eating frosted flakes, right? That just come off the ground,
right.
And some quail on the side. Who knows anything about a fruit right now? Why? And the point is, I've been preparing you. For when you get here, just know that this is so don't just yawn and go, no. When you're healed, when your heart is healed and you've overcome that forgiveness, let me tell you what's on the other side of that. The ability to trust again, the ability to love again, the ability to be generous again,
yeah.
the ability to have your heart malleable again and to be a heart of flesh again, right? That's what's on the other side. And I think so often in the healing process, if God forbid in the middle of healing we get an infection, we go to this part and we'll begin to wind it down here, but we go to that part that really talks about that reproach of Egypt.
Yeah, right.
You mentioned it was another translation. I'm not sure what translation it was, but I really liked the way they said it. The shame of Egypt. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because this generation right here now that is being circumcised, they weren't slaves.
Correct.
And even if and don't think that this is the 40 and under club, right? There are people that just were not of fighting age that did live, right? So right. They might have been 12. They may have right. been, but the truth of the matter, they didn't feel the full effect of slavery. Right. So yes, they may have been they may have been in slavery, but they themselves may not have felt the fullness of being slaves. All of that to say, this shame that these people are walking with, they're ashamed that they were slaves. They're ashamed that they're nomads. They're ashamed that they have nothing. They're ashamed, right? These are all of the things that bring them shame. And yet, just on the outside, what we're seeing is, if it wasn't that they were slaves, if it wasn't that God doesn't open up this sea for them as they walk through, then when they meet Rahab, the first set of kings aren't nervous and like...
Exactly.
if they don't go now through a flooded Jordan, then it's not the second set of kings that
Right.
come. And so often we look in terms of personal, in terms of, man, in this season is all I see. And so because of that, it's all I am.
Yeah.
If
Yep.
in this season I feel broke, then I'm broken. And no, that's not it. This is the season. This is the moment. This is the pivot point. But this is not it. This may be the very moment that everyone around you is looking at you and saying, my God, how real must God be if you're going through that? If that loss that you're going through, if that divorce that you're going through, if you continue to be you in all of that, that may speak more than anything that you can say to convince somebody of something otherwise. So I would say to you, I would encourage you, do not let evidence get in the way of your witness. While we are looking at these stories, while we are beginning and believing that this is who Kingdom Life is, and as we move forward with this group, our leadership teams, and we're believing that there is a promised land, not that it's just one thing or one place, but there is something that God is doing with Kingdom Life, and that there's room for you and the fullness of your story without having to cut out any of the chapters, regardless of where you've been, what you've done, what you're doing.
Yeah.
That there is room for you right now in this story. Mm-hmm. And it is your story attached to this story that will make history.
It's good.
Athena, thank you for joining us. I really did enjoy this.
So did I.
I did.
It was good.
And you're way better looking than Pastor Mike. Put in the comments how much you love the hair. I tell her every day, I dig it so much.
Thank you.
Love it. But Athena, is there, I was going to put you on the spot, but I won't. I'll just do it myself. So what I'm going to say is, I know. Is there room for people who still want to join life groups?
Yes, there is definitely space. So please head on over to klcc.us, sign up, or go on the app. Click the banner that says life groups. Yep, you can text groups, and just really plug in. It is, we have been filling up. So, awesome. If you're someone that really wants to get connected, do so right away. Don't hesitate. Sign up today, and let's get you around a group of people that are really wanting to know more about God, really wanting to just stay connected. And this is how we can really build and be together and be the church and, have our stories intertwined and really go forth.
Well, we thank you. We hope that you enjoyed this evening. Would love to hear from you. So put your thoughts, your questions, your comments, put them all in the chat. We read them all, and we will see you next time. Have a great night.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed our presentation. Would you consider partnering with us to share the hope of God and the love of Jesus by giving? You can give your gift at klcc.us/give. Thank you for your generosity. Also, we would love to connect with you, so please follow, like, and subscribe to all of our social media platforms, as well as downloading our app on both the Apple and Google Play stores. Be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a thing. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.